My daughter-in-law called me too much at my own son's Thanksgiving table. In front of 12 people, while I was holding a casserole dish I had cooked for 6 hours. My son just sat there. He looked at his plate. He said nothing. I smiled, set the dish down, and walked to the bathroom. I turned the faucet on so no one could hear me cry. But what none of them knew was that I had already made a phone call 2 weeks earlier. A phone call that was going to change everything. If you want to see how this ends, stay right here with me. And if these kinds of stories speak to something deep inside you, go ahead and hit subscribe. We put out a new story every single week. Now let me take you all the way back to where this really started. My name is Gerald. I am 64 years old. I spent 31 years working in commercial construction, not in an office, out in the field. I poured concrete in the summer heat. I climbed scaffolding in the rain. I came home every night with dirt under my fingernails and a back that never stopped aching. My wife, Lorraine, was the one who made the house feel like a home. She kept everything together while I kept everything standing. We were a team. We did not need much. We just needed each other, and we needed our boy. Our son Marcus was the best thing we ever did. We knew it from the day he was born. He was smart in a way that made teachers stop and pay attention. He was kind in a way that made strangers feel comfortable around him. He was the kind of child that made you believe you had done something right in this world. Lorraine and I sacrificed for that boy. We did not take vacations. We drove old cars. We ate simple meals. We put every extra dollar into his college fund because we wanted him to have something we never had. A head start. A door already open before he even got there. Marcus went to a state university on a mix of savings and a partial scholarship. He studied business. He graduated with honors. He called us from the parking lot after the ceremony and cried. I cried too. Lorraine cried so hard she could barely talk. He got a job at a mid-sized logistics company right out of school. He worked hard. He moved up fast. By 29, he was a regional manager. By 31, he was making more money than Lorraine and I had ever seen in our lives. We were proud. We are still proud. That part never changed. What changed was the woman he brought home one Easter Sunday when he was 32. Her name was Diane. I want to be careful here because I am not the kind of man who judges people on first impression. I have been wrong before. I know that. So when Marcus brought Diane home and she walked in without saying hello to Lorraine first, I told myself she was nervous. When she looked around our living room with an expression I could not quite name, I told myself she was just quiet. When she barely touched her food and then whispered something to Marcus that made him look uncomfortable, I told myself it was none of my business. I gave her the benefit of the doubt. For almost 2 full years, I gave her everything I had. She and Marcus got engaged 14 months after that Easter. Lorraine and I were invited to celebrate at a restaurant downtown, the kind of restaurant that does not put prices on the menu. I wore my best shirt. Lorraine bought a new dress. We drove an hour to get there. Diane's parents were already seated when we arrived. They were from money, old money. The kind of people who talk about wine like it is a language and treat waiters like furniture. Her father shook my hand without standing up. Her mother looked at Lorraine's dress and smiled in a way that was not a smile. Dinner was polite, careful, like everyone was speaking slowly so they would not accidentally say what they were actually thinking. On the drive home, Lorraine held my hand and looked out the window and said, "Gerald, I hope she makes him happy." I said, "Me too, sweetheart, me too." They got married the following spring. It was a big wedding. Diane's family paid for most of it. I know because Marcus told me, and I could hear something in his voice when he said it. Something like apology. Something like the beginning of a distance I had not noticed until that moment. I walked my son down the aisle. We stood outside the church and I straightened his tie the way I used to when he was small. He looked at me and said, "Dad, I love you." And I believed him. I still believe him. But love and attention are 2 different things, and somewhere after that wedding, Marcus started giving me a lot of one and not enough of the other. Diane moved into Marcus's house. They bought a new place about 6 months later, bigger, in a nicer neighborhood. Lorraine and I were not asked for opinions. We were not asked to help. We found out about the new address in a text message. I told myself it was just them building their life. That is what young couples do. I told myself not to be the kind of father who suffocates his son. But then the calls got shorter, the visits got fewer, holidays started coming with conditions. The first Christmas after the wedding, we were told dinner would be at Diane's parents' house, her family's tradition. We were welcome to come by the next day for a brief visit. A brief visit, on Christmas, to see our only child. Lorraine made cookies and wrapped them in a tin. She smiled when we drove over the next morning. She smiled when we sat in the living room for 45 minutes while Diane showed us photos from the day before on her phone. She smiled the whole drive home. That night, I heard her crying in the kitchen when she thought I was asleep. I got up and sat with her. Neither of us said anything. We just sat there at the kitchen table at midnight, and I held her hand, and I understood then that something had shifted, something that was going to take a long time to name. The next 2 years were more of the same. We were included just enough that you could not call it exclusion, but just little enough that you always felt like you were on the outside of a window, looking at a life that used to belong to you. Then Lorraine got sick. It started as fatigue, then weight loss, then a scan that came back with words no one wants to hear. Pancreatic cancer, stage 2 moving toward 3. The doctors said there were options, there were treatments, there was a chance. We did not tell Marcus right away because Lorraine asked us not to. She wanted to understand what she was facing before she had to explain it to anyone else. I respected that. I gave her 2 weeks. Then I called Marcus and told him. He cried, he said he would be there. He asked what he could do. And for a little while, he showed up. He came to 2 doctor appointments. He called every few days. He brought groceries once and sat at the kitchen table and talked to his mother for 2 hours. Then Diane got pregnant, and everything shifted again. I understood it. A new baby changes everything. Your attention goes where it has to go. I do not blame him for being focused on his wife and the child coming into the world. I do not blame him for any of that. What I blame him for is what he allowed to happen while his mother was fighting for her life. Diane had opinions about how the illness should be managed. She sent Marcus articles about diet and supplements. She told him that stress was a factor and that Lorraine needed to reduce her stress. And somehow, in a way that happened so gradually I almost did not notice, Lorraine's treatment decisions started getting filtered through Diane before they got to Marcus. I would call Marcus to update him, and he would say, "Diane thinks we should look into this other option." Or, "Diane read that the medication you mentioned has significant side effects." Or, "Diane feels like maybe Mom is not getting the best care at that hospital." Diane had a degree in marketing. She had no medical training. She had opinions she read on the internet, and she was inserting those opinions into decisions about my wife's cancer treatment. I stayed quiet. I kept the peace. I told myself Marcus was just leaning on his wife because he was scared. Lorraine had surgery in the spring. It went well. The margins were clear. The oncologist was cautiously optimistic. We sat in a small recovery room and held hands, and I told her we were going to be all right. Marcus came that evening. He stayed for 2 hours. When he left, he kissed his mother on the forehead and squeezed my shoulder and said, "Call me if anything changes." Diane did not come. She was tired from the pregnancy, Marcus said. She sent a text with a flower emoji. Lorraine looked at the flower emoji on her phone for a moment. Then she set the phone face down on the blanket and looked out the hospital window. "Gerald," she said, "I want to have a real Thanksgiving this year." I said, "Then we'll have one. I want Marcus here. I want to cook. I want it to feel normal." "It will," I told her. "I'll make sure of it." She came home from the hospital and started getting stronger, slowly but steadily. She started walking outside again. She started cooking small things. She started sounding like herself again on the phone. By October, she was well enough to plan a real Thanksgiving. She started a list in October. She called Marcus and told him about it. She was excited in a way I had not heard in a long time. She wanted the whole family together. She invited her sister and her sister's husband. She invited my brother Raymond and his wife. She planned a table for 12. Marcus said he would be there. He said Diane would be there too. Their son had been born by then, a healthy boy they named Ethan. Lorraine had only seen the baby 3 times. She was ready to hold him again and make up for lost time. The week before Thanksgiving, Diane called me directly. That was unusual. She never called me directly. She told me that she wanted to make sure the gathering would not be overwhelming. She said her and Marcus had a lot going on with the baby, and she wanted to make sure expectations were managed. She used that phrase, managed expectations. I was 63 years old, and my daughter-in-law was telling me to manage my expectations about seeing my own son at Thanksgiving. I said calmly that Lorraine had been through cancer surgery, and this dinner meant the world to her. Diane said she understood that. She just wanted to make sure the day stayed low-key. I said I would pass that along. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long moment. But I did not say anything to Lorraine. I did not want to dim that light in her eyes. I told myself the day would be fine. Thanksgiving arrived. Lorraine had been cooking since Tuesday. The house smelled like it used to, like stuffing and sweet potatoes and the particular warmth of a home that is ready for its people. Raymond and his wife arrived first. Lorraine's sister Carol arrived with her husband an hour later, and then Marcus arrived with Diane and the baby. The first hour was fine. The baby was passed around and cooed over. Raymond told a bad joke that everyone laughed at anyway. Lorraine sat at the head of the table and glowed. Then it was time to bring the food out. I carried in the turkey. Lorraine brought the stuffing. I went back for the sweet potato casserole, the one Lorraine had been making the same way for 30 years, with the brown sugar crust and the little marshmallows on top. I set it on the table, and Diane looked at it and said, "Oh, that's a lot of sugar. Ethan doesn't need that kind of thing around him." Ethan was 4 months old. He was not eating solid food. He was not going to be harmed by proximity to sweet potato casserole. Lorraine smiled tightly and said, "It's a family recipe." And then Diane said it, loudly enough for the table to hear, looking at me as much as at Lorraine. I just feel like sometimes this family is a bit too much. The table went quiet. Raymond's wife put down her fork. Carol looked at her plate. Marcus looked at his plate. Nobody spoke. I stood there holding that casserole dish. My wife, who had just survived cancer, who had cooked for 3 days to make this table feel like home, who was sitting right there, looked down at her hands. I smiled. I set the dish down carefully. I excused myself and walked to the bathroom. I ran the faucet. I stood over the sink. I looked at myself in the mirror and I took several long breaths. I thought about what I was going to do, and then I thought about what I had already done. Because 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I had made a phone call. Now let me explain something about my history that matters here. When Marcus was young and we were saving every penny for his future, Lorraine and I made a specific decision about our house. We did not just own the house we lived in. We had also inherited a small piece of commercial property from my father, a half-acre parcel on a main road in town with a small warehouse-style building on it. Nothing glamorous, just a useful piece of land that had been rented to a small auto parts distributor for 20 years. That property generated about $2,000 a month in rent. Not a fortune, but steady. We put that money straight into savings and never touched it. When Marcus was in college, he asked me once about that property. I told him that one day it would be part of what I left for him. He nodded and moved on. I do not think he thought much about it after that. What Marcus did not know was that over the years, the area around that property had changed significantly. A new highway interchange had been built less than a mile away. Commercial development had exploded. That parcel, which my father had paid almost nothing for, was now sitting on land that a regional developer had been quietly approaching me about for 2 years. I had been patient. I had waited. I had not told anyone, not even Lorraine at first, because I wanted to understand the full picture before I said a word. The last offer the developer had made was substantial, the kind of number that would change the shape of the rest of our lives. I had been going back and forth on it. Lorraine's illness had pushed me closer to a decision. I wanted to have something in place for her, for both of us. But something else was also shifting in my thinking, something slower and more serious. Because I had watched, over 4 years of marriage, as Diane systematically moved Marcus further and further from his family. I had watched her turn holidays into negotiations. I had watched her filter his relationship with his own mother through her approval. I had watched Lorraine's eyes when Marcus did not come to her second oncology appointment because Diane had a work event. I had watched my wife hold her grandson 3 times in 4 months while Diane's parents saw him every week. I had stayed quiet. Through all of it, I had told myself it was not my place. I had told myself Marcus was an adult. But I am also a man who plans, and 2 weeks before Thanksgiving I made 2 phone calls. The first call was to the developer. I accepted the offer. We signed the preliminary paperwork that week. The second call was to my attorney. His name is Frank. I have known Frank for 20 years. I told him what I wanted to do, and he told me it was absolutely within my rights, and we started the paperwork. I had decided that the proceeds from the property sale were going to be placed into a trust, a specific kind of trust, one that I controlled, one that outlined, in legal language, exactly how the money could be used and by whom. Marcus was named as a beneficiary, but the terms were clear. The funds were available to him for specific purposes: his education, a primary home purchase, healthcare, or documented business investments. They were not available as general cash. They were not accessible without my written approval as trustee. And there was a provision, one that Frank had helped me draft very carefully, that stated the trust terms could be amended at any time at my sole discretion. It was not revenge, not yet, it was protection. I stood in that bathroom on Thanksgiving and I thought about all of it. And then I dried my hands, and I walked back out. I sat down, I helped Lorraine serve the food. I talked to Raymond. I held Ethan for 20 minutes while Diane went to the kitchen, and I looked at that baby's small face and felt nothing but love for him. He had done nothing. He was not part of this. But when dinner was over and people were putting on their coats, I pulled Marcus aside. I asked him to walk me to the back porch. He followed me. We stood outside in the November cold. I could see his breath. I said, "Your mother cooked for 3 days. She had cancer surgery 7 months ago. And your wife told a table full of our family that we are too much." Marcus looked at the ground. I said, "I am not asking you to choose. I am telling you what happened. I am telling you what I saw in your mother's face." He said, "Dad, Diane doesn't always say things the right way." I said, "Marcus, stop." He stopped. I said, "I love you. You know I do. But something has been going wrong in this family for a long time, and I need you to see it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll talk to her." I said, "I hope you do." We went back inside. They left an hour later. Diane said goodbye without looking at me. The drive home was quiet. That night at 11:47, my phone rang. It was Marcus. His voice was different, tighter, lower. He said, "Dad, what did you do?" I sat up in the dark. He said, "Diane's dad called her tonight. He apparently has a friend who works in commercial real estate. He heard something about a property deal in town. He started asking questions. He told Diane." I said, "What did he tell her?" Marcus said that you sold a piece of property, that there was a trust, that he was hearing a number. He paused. "Dad, is it true?" I said, "Yes." Silence. He said, "How much?" I told him the number. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing. He said, "And it's in a trust." I said, "Yes." He said, "With conditions." I said, "Yes." Another pause. He said, "Whose idea was that?" I said, "Mine." He said, "Why?" And I said something I had been preparing to say for a long time. I said, "Because for 4 years I have watched you let your wife make you smaller. I have watched your mother cry. I have watched you miss appointments and shorten calls and send a text with a flower emoji when your mother was in a hospital bed after cancer surgery. And I have stayed quiet because I did not want to cause problems. But tonight your wife called us too much in our own home, and I am done being quiet." Marcus did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "Dad." I said, "I love you, son." He said, "I need some time." I said, "Take all you need." He hung up. I lay in the dark. Lorraine was asleep beside me. I listened to her breathe. I did not sleep that night. The next 2 weeks were the quietest of my life. Marcus did not call. I did not call him. Lorraine asked once if everything was all right, and I told her we had talked and that Marcus was thinking. She looked at me for a moment and nodded and let it go. Then on a Tuesday evening, about 16 days after Thanksgiving, Marcus showed up at the front door alone. I opened it, and he was standing there with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes red around the edges. He looked like he had not been sleeping well either. I opened the door wider, and he came in. We sat in the living room. Lorraine made coffee, and then she went to her room because she understood this was for the two of us. Marcus sat with his mug in both hands, and he stared at the floor for a while. Then he started Tal. "King." He talked for almost 2 hours. He talked about the early days of his relationship with Diane, how her confidence had felt like strength to him at first, how her opinions had felt like direction. How slowly, over time, that had flipped into something he could not name until very recently. He talked about his mother's illness. He talked about how he had told himself he was managing it, staying strong, being practical, when the truth was he had been letting Diane manage him, letting her decide what was too emotional, too much, too overwhelming, using her as a buffer between himself and his own fear. He said, I missed her second oncology appointment because Diane said I was too stressed and needed a day off. And I let her talk me into it, and I have thought about that day more times than you know. He set down his mug. He said, I said I would talk to her after Thanksgiving. I did, it didn't go well. I waited. He said, she told me that you had always been controlling, that you never respected her, that the trust was a manipulation tactic. I said, and what did you think? He looked at me. He said, I think you are my father, and I have been treating you and Mom like background characters in my own life, and I don't know how that happened. I did not say anything, I just let him sit with it. Then he said, I want to fix it. I said, so do the work. He nodded. He and Diane entered couples counseling in January. It was not smooth. There were weeks where Marcus called me sounding hollowed out. There were weeks where I could tell progress was being made. There were moments where I thought it might not hold. But Marcus showed up, for the counseling and for us. He started calling more, not just with updates but with real conversation. He started coming over on Sundays sometimes, just to sit, just to be present. He came to Lorraine's next oncology appointment and sat in that waiting room with her crossword puzzle book and helped her finish it. Lorraine cried in the car on the way home. She told me that night that she felt like she had her son back. I said, you do. Diane was harder. The counseling brought things to the surface that she had been able to keep buried before. She was not a bad person. I came to understand that over time. She was someone who had grown up in a home where love was transactional, where approval was conditional, and where keeping control meant keeping safe. She had brought all of that into her marriage without fully knowing it. When her patterns were named out loud in a therapist's office, she had to decide whether to defend them or examine them. To her credit, she examined them. It took time. It was not a movie moment. There was no single conversation where everything was resolved and we all hugged and laughed. It was small things. A phone call that lasted longer than expected. A Sunday where she stayed for dinner and helped Lorraine clean up after. A moment in the spring where she handed me Ethan without being asked and said, he's been asking for you. He was 7 months old. He was not asking for anything, but I understood what she meant. And I said thank you. And I held my grandson and walked him to the window to look at the yard. Things were not perfect. I do not expect perfect. I have been alive long enough to know that perfect is not what you aim for. You aim for honest. You aim for present. You aim for willing. They were all of those things now. As for the property, the sale went through in February. It was the largest financial transaction of my life. Frank handled everything. The trust was formally established with the terms I had outlined. I sat Marcus down in March and walked him through the entire document. I explained every provision. I explained my thinking. I did not hide anything. He listened. When I finished, he said, "This isn't a punishment, is it?" I said, "No, it's a plan. It's what I should have always had in place. I just needed a reason to finally put it together." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "The number is real." I said, "Yes." He said, "Dad, I didn't know about any of this." I said, "I know. I did not need you to know. I needed to make sure it was handled right." He sat back and rubbed his face. He said, "All those years of you guys driving old cars and taking no vacations." I said, "We had what we needed." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you." I said, "Take care of your family. That's all I need." Summer came. Lorraine's scans in June showed no new activity. The oncologist used the word stable with confidence for the first time. Lorraine sat in the parking lot of the hospital and called Carol and cried the good kind of crying. We went on a trip that August. Nothing extravagant. A cabin near a lake about 3 hours from home. Lorraine and I had been talking about it for years and never done it. We finally did it. We sat on a porch and watched the water and read books and cooked simple meals, and it was the most peaceful week I had had in years. Marcus called every other day. Once he called just to tell me he had been thinking about the summers we spent fixing up the garage when he was a teenager. That we used to listen to the radio, and he used to hand me tools, and neither of us talked much, but he said those were some of his favorite memories of growing up. I sat on that porch at the lake with the phone against my ear and looked out at the water and felt something settle in my chest. I said, "Mine too, son." When I think about Thanksgiving now, the one where Diane said we were too much, I do not feel the anger I felt that night. Anger does not last in me the way it used to. I am too old and too tired and too grateful for that. What I feel is something quieter, a sense that sometimes the only way back to something good is through something hard, that sometimes a family has to crack before it can be put back together the right way. I did not set out to teach anyone a lesson. I set out to protect what was mine, my wife, my son, the work of a lifetime. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, something shifted that I had not expected. Diane came over one afternoon in the fall, about a year after that Thanksgiving. She came alone. Marcus had Ethan at a friend's birthday party. She knocked on the door, and when I opened it, she asked if she could come in and talk. We sat at the kitchen table. Lorraine made tea. Diane put her hands flat on the table and looked at me and said, "I owe you an apology." I waited. She said, "What I said at Thanksgiving was cruel, and it wasn't the only thing. There were 100 smaller things before that, and I think you know that, and I know that." I said, "I know." She said, "I thought I was protecting Marcus. I thought I was building something. But I think I was actually just afraid of how much he loves you and how much that love required something from me that I didn't know how to give." I looked at this woman who had caused my wife real pain, who had put up walls and inserted herself into places she did not belong and made a hard season of our lives harder. And I also looked at a woman who was sitting at my kitchen table telling the truth. I said, "Diane, I am not a man who holds grudges. I am a man who holds boundaries. There is a difference. You are always welcome in this house. My son loves you. That baby loves you. What I need from you is simple. I need you to love my son in a way that makes him bigger, not smaller. I need you to let him be a son while he is your husband. That is all I need." She nodded. Her eyes were wet. Lorraine reached across the table and put her hand over Diane's hand. Nobody said anything for a moment. That was enough. Ethan started walking in October. We were there for the first steps. Actually there in the living room, not watching a video sent 2 days later. We were on the floor with him, Lorraine and I, holding out our hands while he wobbled toward us with his whole face lit up with the effort of it. He made it, 3 steps, 4 steps, and then he fell into Lorraine's arms and she laughed the kind of laugh that fills a whole room. I looked at Marcus across that room, and he was watching his mother hold his son, and there were tears on his face, and he was not trying to hide them. I did not say anything. Some moments do not need words. What I know is this: you can love your children completely and still refuse to disappear for them. You can be patient and still have a line. You can forgive without forgetting what the forgetting cost you. I sold a piece of land my father left me. I put the money somewhere safe. I drew a boundary in legal language because the emotional language had not been heard. And in doing so, I did not lose my son. I did not blow up a family. I just made it clear that I was still here, that I was not going away, that the man at the end of the table was not background. He was the whole foundation. Lorraine is still here. She is still fighting and still cooking and still asking me every morning if I want 1 egg or 2. I always say 2. She always makes 3. Marcus comes over most Sundays now. Sometimes Diane comes. Sometimes it is just him and Ethan. Sometimes it is all of them together, and the house is loud and messy and full in a way that I had started to wonder if I would ever feel again. I sit at the head of that table, and I look at the faces around it, and I feel something I can only call earned. Not easy, earned. And when Ethan reaches up from his high chair and grabs my finger with his small hand and holds on, I think about my father and his land, and the long, quiet way that love moves through a family from one generation to the next. You do not always see it while it is happening, but it is always moving, always finding its way. That is the only kind of story worth telling.